Hello and welcome to Banking Transform, the top podcast in retail banking. I'm your host, Jim Marous, owner and CEO of the Digital Bank Report and co-publisher of the Financial Brand. As artificial intelligence continues to advance and reshape banking, achieving a high level of AI maturity becomes crucial for financial institutions to remain competitive and relevant in the modern landscape. But what determines an organization's AI maturity? Evident has just published an extensive study on AI innovation and maturity across major banks. Their research analyzed 60 of the largest banks in North America and Europe to understand how banks are positioning themselves for an AI-driven future. I'm excited to have Alexandra Mousavizadeh, co-founder and CEO of Evident, on the Banking Transform podcast. We'll be discussing what determines a financial institution's AI maturity, the advantage AI maturity provides, and how organizations can keep pace with the market leaders. To stay competitive, banks need to develop an innovation strategy, invest in talent, and fully embrace AI's potential. There are still many unknowns, but one thing is clear: AI maturity will increasingly separate the winning banks of the future. So welcome to the show, Alex. It is somewhat amazing to me how fast we moved from Evident introducing this exciting research study and the two of us being able to dig into the findings. But I really appreciate your time today. Before we discuss your research, can you share a little bit about yourself and your firm?
Jim, thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here on your show. Well, a little bit about myself. I'm a Danish economist. I did my degree in economics, mathematics, and I actually did my thesis in game theory, which at the time, back in '95, seemed a little quaint, but has definitely come barreling back and been of great use now covering AI. So much of that rests on, well, not all of it, but a lot of it on sort of game theoretical principles. But I have spent my whole career building indices. I've been at Moody's on the sovereign side. I've been head of country risk management at Morgan Stanley, and I've run an index called the Prosperity Index. And over the last 5 years, I was head of intelligence at a media company in the UK, where we were commissioned to do the first ever global AI index measuring the strength of national AI ecosystems, which we got commissioned to do back in 2017 and launched the index in 2018. And that was really my first foray into getting really deep into the weeds of measurement of AI development and deployment, but at a national level. It became quite clear 2 years ago that this was something that businesses were really keen to get as well, i.e. getting a measurement of where they stood against their peers on their AI adoption journey, and hence circled out and set up Evident, which produces the Evident AI Index on AI adoption, which we launched in January this year. So we have been at the in the engine room of measurement of AI for more than half a decade, but Evident itself only launched and became visible 6 months ago, which of course was very good timing with the release of ChatGPT and the discussions around generative AI, which has put definitely AI at the top of every CEO's mind and in every board pack, not only in the banks, but across every sector. We have focused on the banks first, but we will cover more sectors.
So that being said, what motivated Evident to undertake this research of AI maturity in banking specifically? What were you hoping to uncover?
Yeah, well, we definitely saw there was a white space, so to speak, in terms of a lack of data-driven analysis and measurement of AI adoption. And seeing this white space and seeing that no one had attempted to do this, the motivation for stepping in was not only that this is something that we were quite experienced in, i.e. the sort of measurement of, what is the concept of an AI ecosystem? How do you measure it? And what are all of the components that go into measurement of an AI ecosystem? So we felt we were definitely the right team at the right time in a space that hadn't been covered before. So we call it, it was the right people at the right time stepping into a white space. Yeah. Well, what we hoped to uncover was when you put something on a benchmark that has never been done before, you're suddenly creating a lot of transparency where there hasn't been any. And secondly, you're establishing the blueprint for what is AI adoption. So you're putting a stake in the ground and really setting the goalposts, or establishing what we hope to be the gold standard for AI adoption. So if you articulate what is AI adoption and how do you measure it, and you're the first to go out and do that, hopefully we over time can emerge as a sort of a global standard benchmark for AI adoption, not only for banks, but across all sectors and also government as well.
So when you're looking at AI adoption, that's not exactly the same as AI maturity, because AI maturity puts measurements on what things are important. So when you're developing this research, do you predetermine what AI maturity was be composed of, or did it come out of the research? And secondly, how do you get the information? How do you get the data?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, we do predetermine, and that is based on a lot of experience in what are the factors that are important in AI maturity? What do you need to have in place? And so those components are really four. We look at your entire talent stack. How talented is your entire sort of end-to-end AI talent in your company? What is your innovation stack? So what kind of infrastructure do you have in place? How is your data organized? What is your innovation strategy? Do you run a centralized or a decentralized model? Do you build? Do you buy? How much do you do, research? How do you infuse your bank with an innovative mindset? Do you patent this? Do you partner? There are lots of ways to think about AI implementation accelerators, and they can come in many forms. You can partner with big tech to help do that. You can partner with universities. You can work with a lot of vendors. You can invest in AI companies and take leading roles in those, with the view to onboard those capabilities in your company. So there's sort of many levers you can pull on the innovation side, and we look at all of those. And we don't pass judgment on necessarily what's best. We just uncover these are the many ways that banks go about it, and we try and weight it relatively equally. But we do select them on a predetermined basis, in the sense that we know that this is the range of tools or levers that you can pull, and we map that. And then we also look at leadership. It's interesting because at the end of the day, leadership is at the heart of what drives an innovative company, because you've got to set a vision, you've got to know where you're going. That narrative has to be very clearly expressed both internally and externally. And how you organize your company is quite a determining factor on how quickly you can run, because you need to have a sort of a straight line to management if you want to present use cases and solutions that are AI driven and make some decisions pretty quickly. So you need to have an organizational structure that is quite nimble for that, and that's very different from prior organizational structures. So we see that there has to be made changes on that as well. And then our fourth pillar, we look at responsible AI and the visibility of the position that the banks are taking on really bringing that up to the forefront and looking at what these banks are doing, expressing how they're handling the data, what controls do they have in place, what principles are they following. It's an extremely nascent area of reporting, but we're trying to create the checklist of what what good behavior looks like.
So how do you get your information, your inputs?
Yes, this is we are outside in. We take an outside in approach, which has definite benefits, but also a few drawbacks. The benefits are that we don't rely on any surveys. We can source this data externally. It's all resting on publicly available data, which means that we mine millions of data points that sit in the external footprint of the banks. These are areas that the banks themselves will express through strategies and IR documents and job openings and communications with regulators and so on. But then we also mine a lot of third-party data sources where we look at investment profile, what banks are investing in, patent repositories, H-indexes, everything to do with research and lots of other external sources. That means that we then compile all of this data that makes the comparisons comparable because there's no subjectivity in it. The methodology is set, the data is sourced from publicly available data, and that means that it is it's completely objective, if you like. It doesn't rely on any surveys, and surveys are great in certain instances, but on areas such as these, it depends very much. If we were relying on surveys, it would depend on who do you speak to in the bank, where exactly do they sit.
I know that one real well. Yeah.
So there's some pitfalls. So there are certain things that you can't see. Obviously, is looking at some of the struggles that the banks have from taking a model from from ideation into production, and looking at what sort of return on investment you're getting from a particular model in a particular use case. But that's something we're going to be working on next year, where we are actually going to do a bit of the reverse, as in an inside out, where we're going to be looking at a proprietary data set that are looking at slightly more sensitive data that the banks do want to share, but don't want to put in the public sphere.
Got you. So I would imagine, maybe I'm taking a leap here, but generative AI actually helps your process of collecting information, doesn't it?
Well, we do use generative AI for some things. It's still not as accurate as we would have hoped, so we don't rely on it fully, because there's always got to be a human in the loop to check on accuracy. But there's certainly ways in which that it helps us a lot. You can use it to crawl over a lot of the data and come up with some correlations that you might not have spotted yourself. But also we do synthesize a lot of data, so it's really nice to be able to use some of these generative tools to generate some of our ideas for insights as well. Because with this incredibly large data set, sometimes it's a bit hard to wrap your own arms around. It's quite nice to have a large language model tool to support in that effort.
So one of the big takeaways from your research was the high concentration of AI innovation among just truly a handful of banks. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, 5 banks published 67% of the research and filed 94% of the patents. Why is this level of concentration occurring? Is it logical that these are the ones that have the money, or is it deeper than that?
Well, I think it's a lot deeper than that. I mean, money does absolutely help. It's expensive endeavor to invest in AI. It takes a lot of investment in infrastructure and research and talent, of course. But what we saw when we released the index back in January, that the top 10 were dominated by North American banks, by the US and the Canadian banks. And in that mix, there are some big players like JP Morgan that comes top of the index, but also maybe some smaller and less expected players sit in the top 10, such as RBC and TD from Canada, and others. And what we saw was the common denominator was that a couple of things. First of all, the leadership in those banks that sit in the top 10 had made a decision 6-7 years ago that they were going to be tech first. They were going to be AI-driven banks. They were not going to be better banks helped by technology. They were going to become tech companies that were financial services, obviously at the heart. But they were going to model themselves on big tech, which means setting up R&D centers, investing heavily in AI talent, really thinking about organizational structures and how to infuse the banks with an innovative culture. And we know that from interviews with the leadership of the banks that they very early on thought about that model was the right one when thinking about how to transition the banks to become AI-led. And we can see that now, sort of 6-7 years later, that has really paid off. And typically, that has been the North American banks and not so much the European banks. So we see the North American banks really pull ahead in these structures, which means that they've also invested in pure AI research and applied AI research, and they publish research much more than the European counterparts do. Because again, modeling on big tech, publishing research has the added benefit of attracting AI talent. AI talent is a very rare resource. There are not that many out there, and they've got lots of other places to go other than banks. So banks really have to think about how do we become an attractive place for AI talent. What does the AI talent want? They want to be able to publish. They want to be able to speak at conferences and submit papers. They want to participate in the open source ecosystem. They want to have lots of interesting use cases to work on. And we need to be a place that can provide all of this for the AI talent. There is a war on talent. The report we did prior to the innovation report was a deep dive into AI talent and how that flows. And it was remarkable to see, again, it follows what the innovation report showed. The talent follows and goes into the banks that has that kind of structure. So it is a self-reinforcing way of organizing yourself. And my worry is that the better that the sort of stronger banks do, the more capable they are of attracting the good talent. And, being able to harness the AI innovation as it happens, which is accelerating, and being able to onboard that relatively swiftly because they have the AI talent and the right infrastructure and the right organizational structure. Whereas those banks that haven't started to really think about that are sort of falling further and further and faster behind. And so there is a concern that there's going to be this real gap emerging between those who are really focusing on this and those who really aren't.
So it's interesting. Before I attended your webinar last week, I was thinking to myself going, well, why does publishing your research and filing the patents even matter? Well, you mentioned it, but it's kind of like a flywheel effect. Number one, it shows that there's senior management commitment to AI because they're putting resources toward these elements. But just as importantly, and you brought up in your webinar, that this helps generate talent, which takes care of getting some more research done, more patents are filed, and management gets a more well-rounded dive into the AI area. So you did mention that North American banks accelerated ahead of European banks across multiple metrics. What do you attribute this gap to? Because in many ways, European banks in some areas have been more out there, more innovative. But what is making the big difference here?
Yes, I mean, I would say that there are European banks who do incredibly well. I mean, you can see from the index, we do see some European players very high up on the rankings. Got ING, UBS, BNP Paribas, that have a very innovative culture and are very strong. But they do take a slightly different tack, which is more of a engineering approach where the solutions are embedded in the lines of business, where you would look at a use case, you look at a problem, looking at so which models and how do we solve that in the business lines. So they're quite decentralized. Many of them have not established a center of excellence or a research lab or a central unit to make some decisions around what to prioritize. And more importantly, I think when you look at the role of the centralization or the sort of hubs that sit in the center and go across business lines, those are, especially now with generative AI, that really showed the value of having a centralized body that looks across the bank, because generative AI can be used across many lines of business. So if there is a thinking through sort of what generative AI tools are we using? How are we going to, look at all of the hundreds of use cases where it can be used across the lines of business? Where do we centralize all of this, and how do we make a decision on what to prioritize? That is much harder to do if it's done by, decentralized and within the lines of business. Because how do you make a decision on what to go with if it's a bank-wide decision on how to prioritize and invest in generative AI? But that's not just for generative AI. That's also, you were talking about the sort of value of research. many of the American banks would argue, look, we do research that is not just for sort of short-term problem solving, but we try to look at the horizon and look at what are the problems that may arise in sort of 3 to 4 or 5 years. So banks that have been deep in the weeds of the research of synthetic data, say, or causal AI, or deep learning and neural networks, are much more able to deploy this across the lines of business in the bank, which are AI capabilities that are cross-cutting. So again, back to sort of what's the value of centralization and the value of research. That is that you're much more able to productionize this type of research as the problems arise and where the use cases arise. So that's the value of having it decentralized. And I think what the European banks have done in the past and sort of still doing, but I think a lot of them are rethinking that now, is a much more sort of an engineering and decentralized approach to be like, let's just be really specific with what we're pulling in of capabilities to solve exactly the problems that we have right in front of us right now. So it's a bit more short-term focus and perhaps not as long-term as really AI requires you to be, because it takes time to get your head around what these tools can do and what sort of problems they can solve. And sometimes you just need to have that capability build up in the organization in order to respond to problems medium to long term.
So obviously the bigger banks have a leg up because of their ability to invest in research, patents, and talent. But is the ability to become an AI mature organization only possible for the biggest banks? Or can composable solutions where AI talent and research comes from outside the financial institution provide an avenue for AI maturity at smaller organizations?
No, absolutely. I mean, and I would just say that when we compile the index, we look at a lot of the data in proportion to the size of the banks. That means that smaller banks can do quite well. As I mentioned before, TD Bank is not a big bank, but it sits in the top 10. And that is because it has, in proportion to its size, a high level of AI talent. It has a very forceful and strong sort of innovation. You've got a lot of activity in all of those 7 levers of AI innovation, and so on. So according to the way we've structured it, it's not that it's just the bigger banks that prevail here because they've got more money to spend. It really is showcasing that with a decision and with prioritizing the resources into AI investment and investing in the reorganization of the banks, you can actually do incredibly well. And you can, so it's not just the firepower that you have. Now, JP Morgan has, a lot of resources that it put to work in the AI space. Is probably the bank that spends most in absolute terms, but also in proportion to its size on AI. Just in it, I think it spent $14 billion this year on digital transformation and AI, when AI is making up a larger proportion of that spend. But it is, but they get to sort of both the volume, the absolute numbers, and the proportion tick marks there. But you can absolutely be a smaller bank, and with the decision to make this a priority, and sort of get moving now, you definitely have the opportunity to do very, very well. And then you can decide, like, how much do we want to, as a smaller bank, you're up against decisions such as, do we spend on building this in-house? Or is it better for us to actually buy some of the solutions that are already out there and incorporate them into our existing structures? And so that's the debate that's very much happening in the smaller banks right now. Where is the what's the cost benefit analysis of that? The bigger banks have a tendency to build as much as they can in-house for a variety of reasons. But the smaller banks now, and also with the advancement and the sophistication of the AI vendors and tools out there, you can actually achieve an enormous amount by buying a lot of this from outside sources.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's going to be interesting too, because if I'm a mid-sized or small organization, I'm going to want an AI maturity model for the people I might partner with, because it's outside many cases, it's outside the financial institution realm, but in the solution provider realm. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic, because it's so liquid. It's so fluid out there as far as what can be done. One other thing you found was that 6 of the 60 banks you analyzed, only 6 were seriously pursuing patents as an innovation strategy. How important is the focus on patents? Why aren't more banks doing it? And how do you equate patents to the importance of banking innovation? Is it simply a stake of risk reward, that the more stakes you put in the ground, the more likely is you're going to hit some?
Yeah, it was very interesting. And again, you see many more, it's the US banks that double down on patenting. The European banks don't do that so much. And there's sort of some structural reasons in that. It's also slightly harder to patent in Europe than it is in the US. But it's also sort of it goes through phases, the questions of patents. Some banks have had just a culture of patenting pretty much everything.
Capital One, exactly.
Oh, Bank of America is another one.
Yes.
And there's sort of some of that is a bit, is a defensive move. We've got, we've got, areas that they feel they want to put a moat around and patent for, because they might need that in the future. So, you're sort of creating that defense line, and you're using the patent strategy for that to put a stake in the ground and make sure that no one steps into that. And some create just lots and lots of patents because, some of them are tradable. So it actually becomes a line of business in and of itself. But you definitely see the patents in areas that are, differentiated areas, as they call them, right? They're very close to, high revenue growth in areas that are moving quite quickly. Whereas you see a lot of the research that gets submitted are on maybe less competitive areas. So you sort of see a flip side. You get a lot of research papers in areas that are maybe not so competitive, but you see all of the patents take place in areas that are very competitive. So and then you've got some banks who do neither. They don't patent, or they don't publish their research, and they keep it very much in-house. And don't want to express anything externally at all, because they want to sort of keep a very arms around it and to themselves. So you have a variety of strategies, but I mean, in the past at least, the patenting from banks' point of view has been a way in which you can demonstrate your innovation, and it has been also to put a stake in the ground and say, look, we're innovative and we are patenting our innovations, and a way to demonstrate the innovation has been through a model of patenting. Now, where that goes in the future, I mean, many are saying that the trend, some banks are doubling down. You see some banks are thinking that this is actually a trend that they've decided not to double down on the patents for a variety of reasons. They don't see that is benefiting them that much or creating that much value. So it's interesting. It's one we watch obviously very closely. We have a patent tracker, so we see every patent on AI going out from the bank side. But it's interesting to follow, and we do topic modeling as well on it, so we can see exactly what topics, what areas banks are keen to patent on.
So Alex, this whole research you've done is talking about AI maturity from the standpoint of investments and commitment to the technology. How do you figure out how successful organizations are? Because I've talked to some of the bigger players that you interviewed, and many of them say, geez, we feel like we're behind on being able to personalize experiences across the entire spectrum of a customer journey. So investments by themselves doesn't equate to success. How do we figure that out?
Yeah, it is. It's the big question. It is. It's very early days. When we set out to do the index, we were trying to figure out how do we measure the outputs, i.e., the efficacy of the AI investment, because that's on everyone's mind. I'm spending all of this money on getting all of the components of the ecosystem as strong as it can get, from my talent to my data to my innovation structures and so on, with the view that having a strong ecosystem will lead to good outcomes. Now we're really at a point where we've reached a tipping point where the banks have invested now for 5, 6, 7 years. A lot of it up until maybe a year ago was explorative. So let's explore this. Let's test this AI model. Let's see if this reaps some benefits. Let's see if this works. To now we're fully in a mode where there's an expectation of return on investment. There's an expectation of better output and better products, hyper personalization, much better fraud management, better cybersecurity, a lot, faster trading, better, loan and credit lines and so on, analysis, fewer defaults. All of this rests on AI, and all of this is now coming through. The experimentation has been done. The AI models are in production. They are now being used, and they're obviously, there's feedback loops constantly to improve it. But we're at a point where senior management is asking for return on investment on the AI in the specific use cases, in the specific lines of business. What is the dollar value of this use case? And what is the return on investment? All banks are calculating this internally. It's a very difficult thing to isolate, because one thing is that you can have a really good team and a really good model, and invested heavily in that. But sometimes it's practical things of getting from model to production that have nothing to do with your AI capabilities. But it can be, product management and strategy, identifying the low-hanging fruit, really seeing where with little effort and actually maybe not as sophisticated a model, we can actually get enormous amounts of return just by doing this, that, and the other. But in being able to spot that and having the people sort of along the pipeline who can help move from model to production is sometimes where it falls down. Right, so looking at the entirety of what of the elements that go into successful implementation and impact on product is not just about the models. So what we are actually going to be doing end of year is going to be in October we're going to be publishing a very big report on use case mapping, where we're going to be going through how do you measure return on investment. It's internally debated. We know internally in banks you would have a dollar figure that would be disputed internally, because it's how do you create the attribution to AI is not a sort of a straight line.
Yep.
But if what we are intending to do is trying to come up with a blueprint of how to do that, and then end of year we'll be looking at creating that measurements of output where we can in the public space, and then equivalent to NPS scores, but very AI related. And then we are going to be doing a more in-depth, as I said before, private look and benchmark at all of those critical questions that banks don't necessarily want to put in the public sphere, but aspects of sophistication of model, time to production, and return on investment. Because really, once you have that, then you can draw the line back to, well, what capabilities that was invested in created the biggest success, right?
Yep.
What's the correlation between the inputs and the outputs? And that's really where we want to land. But up until now, I would say, and really the banks still, even wanting to know what the output is, are really comparing themselves and thinking about having a strong AI ecosystem. And that's where this public index comes in.
No doubt. And that, if they're investing in it, you're going to get your return on investment in to a certain degree. But as you said, in a general way to say, how does an investment in risk and fraud compare to the investment on customer experience? What's the impact of democratizing the the distribution of insights as opposed to simply being great reports. We talk about this all the time in our business that it's great if you have all this information, but if you're not deploying it and not making it so customers see the same information across all channels, you've really weakened the value of what you have invested in. And in many cases, organizations have spent millions of dollars simply getting great reports on what their customer base looks like, but never taking the final mile to say, how do I deploy against that? And you're referencing the ability to look at private engagements and being able to even measure on a global basis the value of these investments and getting some basic trends. You're going to get a good feel for that. But again, it starts at how much you're committing to AI. One other interesting thing is that what types of AI are you investing in? Obviously, we talked about ChatGPT already. And generative AI impacting the competitive landscape, it's an investment in ChatGPT functionality, generative AI functionality, more valuable than another type of investment. I mean, I would imagine that's going to eventually come out of this analysis that you're doing of financial institutions, correct?
Yes, that's right. I think generative AI is obviously a game changer for many, many businesses, and it's definitely going to be very useful for banks, and it already is. On the code side, but also on supporting, financial analysts on the, wealth management side and for sales and marketing. But there are lots of things that generative AI cannot do for banks because generative AI does not throw up a 0 or a 1, so it can't make a decision, but it's very good at pulling information together and coming up with something that sounds pretty good. But when you're making decisions on loans and credit lines and mortgages and so on, that's in a different side. That's where you're looking at sort of machine learning tools and so on that have been invested in and used by banks for, a decade, if not more. And it's becoming more and more sophisticated. And I think the outside of generative AI, it is, that's very much the lion's share of where banks are investing. Machine learning, neural networks, deep learning, and causal AI and synthetic data, because that's all pointed to the parts of the business that is huge revenue generators, which is loan books and so on. And the trading side as well, where generative AI simply can't be used. So while it definitely can be used for some things and can help cut some costs and create some efficiencies in the banks also, we must remember, are highly regulated. So generative AI is a particularly tricky one to use for banks, especially when it touches any of the customer data, and you've got to be super careful with that. From data privacy perspective. But so what they're investing in right now, it's interesting because we thought we were going to see sort of relatively quickly a hike in job openings that were related to generative AI, prompt engineers, data engineers in general, but there really hasn't been that yet. We anticipate that's going to come up in the next quarter or two. But right now, banks are really busy looking at what are my use cases, where can I use generative AI, identifying them, and now I think we're going to see in Q3 and Q4 a slew of announcements of generative AI being put into production, but on internal data only. So for efficiency gains on internal data, nothing that touches the customer data at this stage. Is much too dicey to use generative AI for that. But then what's on the horizon? On the horizon are things such as quantum. We follow that very closely as well. And then the sort of combination of quantum capabilities and AI are particularly interesting for banks and potentially existential. When I start, getting my head into, and talking to the people around us who do the quantum, capabilities side, and the companies that are starting to look at that for banks, you're looking at generative AI and thinking, oh boy, that's like not even scratching the surface. What really is going to upend everything is once quantum capabilities are really there, that's going to upend all transactions, cyber security, firewalls, and trading particularly are the areas that, trading speeds would be, unrecognizable with quantum capabilities. So those banks that are preparing for that now is something we're watching out for, like who's getting themselves ready for that, and who's, and most of the big banks are already hiring quantum teams and looking at use cases, and that's really interesting to follow.
Well, it's interesting too, because as I dig in my mind what the possibility of all this is, you have organizations like Bank of America that have massive amounts of data and research from their Erica implementation, something that many people said, yeah, who needs this voice banking thing? But the transformation of what they've been able to do in that platform is certainly amazing feeder information for a generative or a conversational AI model that most institutions really don't have captured yet, because they weren't doing it in the way they were doing it. So the way the inputs, as you mentioned, how valuable are the inputs to go with the other inputs that can combine to work together. So, what area do you see, being in this space for quite some time, what area of AI innovation do you actually expect to take off in the next 3 years, let's say?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is, I'm really curious to see, first of all, a game changer will be if the next generations of large language models become precise enough to be used on, customer data, and if it's accurate enough. Because then I think we're going to see a range of new products coming out of that from the banks. Because then all of a sudden you can have personalized customer interactions that are AI driven only, right? So that could potentially be a sort of definitely something to watch out for. You've got a chat GPT 5, 6 or 7. That would be interesting. That would be then sort of the nature of banking will look quite different if that's the case. And then there's a lot of speculation around how the large language models have they sort of reached a plateau, because OpenAI has basically trained on the entirety of the internet, and so there's not a lot more data to train on. So it is hitting ceilings, and the question is, how can you make it more accurate if you reach the end of all the data that you can train on? So let's see. We're watching that, And again, I think as I said before, I really think that that quantum is going to be a game changer beyond all of the AI out there, and the combination of AI and quantum is going to be one to watch out for. Unsupervised machine learning, deep learning, all of that is just making the banks faster and smarter and better all the time. And as they continue to improve, the ones that are sitting on the front end of that are going to reap the benefits and are just going to create and obtain more and more market share. And the ones who are not are probably not going to be in business. I think that what I would not have said 6 months ago, but I think what we're seeing now is that the changing the bank versus running the bank question has changed. To run the bank, you have to change the bank. You can't the running the bank is gone. In order to run the bank, you have to change the bank. And I think that is the big difference now. And that the big difference now, because you're seeing an accelerated pace of AI innovations that are going to have a big impact on the financial services sector. So if you're not going to change the bank mindset and only a run the bank mindset, I think it's game over.
Boy, that. By the way, I'm going to attribute it to you, but that quote can be used again, because it's such a key element that, I was looking at my question about what innovations you see taking place in the next 3 years, and you really talked about probably the next 18 months at the most. And what's interesting, it wasn't but 5 years ago that we were saying, what do you see happening in the next 5 to 10 years? We don't talk about those time frame anymore. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it's the speed of change. And you said it, that those organizations that aren't putting pieces in place today will never catch up, because it's only going faster. I talked to a gentleman from IBM recently on a podcast, and I said, I'm overthinking this, but is the transformation of AI going faster than even the technologists that built it? And he goes, it has definitely happened that way. That basically it's almost creating its own innovation, and we're all trying to harness it, trying to capture that fire. So it's very interesting. So let's say I'm a modest-sized organization, and I'm trying to take one piece of advice from your research around how I can boost my AI maturity today. What would it be?
The first thing to do is to set, and I know it sounds, but is to set a strategy. You've got to know where you're going. If you don't figure out what your strategy is, do you want to be able to adopt generative AI and build, machine learning and those kinds of capabilities to make the company better? You have to know where you're going. You've got to have both a centralized and a decentralized decision making. You've got to have a place where AI decisions for the organization ladders up to a hub that can help prioritize. And you've got to infuse the entirety of the organization with AI talent, because if you're sitting in the engine room and you're just doing the same thing you've done over and over again without any AI capability, you're never going to spot where the AI can help you. If you're sitting alongside an AI engineer, AI developer, data scientist, a data engineer who can say, hang on a second, you've done that thing 20 times today. There's a better way to do that. Oh, exactly. That's going to make my life a lot easier, right? But if you don't have your AI engineers sitting alongside in the engine room, working on the products, working with the team on a day-to-day basis, you won't spot the opportunities. You've got to have the AI talent to spot the opportunities. So you've got to infuse the organization with AI talent. So you've got to double down on hiring AI talent as soon as you possibly can.
Boy, that is so key, because as you said, you have to make it so the AI goes all the way to the top, but it also has to be distributed across the whole organization. And it actually reminds me on a very, very simplistic basis, Google Maps, that, as I'm using a GPS system, if I don't know where I'm going, the GPS has no value. On the other hand, if I don't have inputs from every other driver that's using the map system at that time, and if we're not talking back and forth, you also lose all value, because you're not getting the real-time changes in the marketplace or changing the road situation that you would otherwise. And I think that's such a key learning for innovation in general, but as banking is general, that if we stay pat, if we look at this as simply like implementing new technology, it will never work. It's evolving. And, unfortunately, banking has gone through its entire legacy with data owned by a department and had to be asked for based on what your needs were. If I was a direct marketer, I had to ask for data that reinforced the project I was doing, and it would probably take a year later to get the results back from what I did. That's no longer going to make it. And I think that's not just with AI, but any innovation, but very key. Your research obviously blew me away. I wouldn't have contacted you so quickly if it wasn't for that. How do our listeners get a copy of our 51-page research report?
Yes. Well,
and how much does it cost?
No, it's free. We are radical transparency. We are on evidentinsights.com, and you can just put your name and your email address in there. You click on our Insights tab, and you can download our key findings report from January, our talent report from June, and our innovation report from a week ago. Then we've got our use case mapping report coming out, and we've got a leadership report coming out also in October, and we're doing a responsible AI report. And then in November, we expand and update the index from 23 banks to 50, and we are going to release a key findings report then as well. So just go online, and you can just download it for free.
So we are going to also put a link on the episode notes so that people can directly link from the podcast notes itself. And one last question, I forgot to ask you, what were you most surprised about when you did your research? What kind of just blew you away and said, I didn't expect that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good, it's fascinating. We crowd around the computer when we had uploaded all the data, and we hit the button to see the rankings for the first time, and we sort of fell silent for a while, looking at the clear domination. As I said in the beginning, it was a clear domination in the index of the North American banks, and I think the surprising thing was to see two Canadian players. Not surprising when you sort of dig into sort of how they've organized themselves, and they're sort of set up just like the big US banks, and sort of got that mindset. But that was quite surprising. It was very surprising to see the UK banks not doing well at all. and that was a bit surprising to see them so low down on the index, I think. And then I think the third element of surprise is just how small the pool of AI talent is. Everyone talks about the war on talent, and then when you actually have a data point on sort of what is the size of that AI talent pool that sits in the banks, it's really small. So there really is a war on talent, which does make me a bit nervous.
Well, and it's not just within the financial services industry. It's a war on talent with every company everywhere.
Yeah, that is true. So I think that's maybe not so much a surprise, but I think the surprise was just how tight that market is. So I think it is, there's a lot of knocking on doors at universities, at computer science programs right now, getting them young straight into the banks. That is what we're seeing for sure.
So what I told my son, I said, data analytics and AI, and he graduated with it and he's doing well, but it's one of those things you go, if I can give you one recommendation, I can see a train come down the road, and the challenge now, as you are probably well aware, is that there's not much talent in the universities to teach it because they've all gone to private business. Exactly. The payoff is so huge that it almost makes more sense to go to a community college where people give back by teaching, even though they're actually an implementer in the marketplace. But it's a crazy time. Alexandra, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to Banking Transformed, winner of 3 international awards for podcast excellence. If you enjoy what we're doing, please take 30 to 45 seconds to show some love in the form of a review. Finally, be sure to catch my recent articles on the financial brand and check out the research you're doing on the Digital Banking Report. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to our senior producer, Leah Hassage, and audio engineer and video producer, Will Pritz. I'm your host, Jim Marous. Until next time, remember, AI has the ability to unleash the full potential of intelligent innovation, transforming banking and redefining the future.